Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back, and we're very happy now to have the interactive session where we really hope to hear from you. So hopefully you took good notes from the excellent lecture of Minister Johansson, and I think this is really a conversation for you. So I'll give the opening words to you, Mr. Johansson, and your job, as I said, is to inspire, to provoke, and to hopefully get a good debate and discussion going. So maybe a second round of applause for Mr. Ogmundur Jonasson.
Well, now it is you who will do the talking. I will do more of the listening and probably interacting. But what I would like to ask you is this fundamental question: how do we change the world? As I told you, my beliefs in this respect have changed over the years. I was a firm believer in a particular ideology, socialism, and in recent years I've become more skeptical, and as I told you, we, the proponents of socialism, we always answered criticism by saying or urging our critics to wait and bear with us, because we were changing the world and we were creating it anew with new values and new systems, and they only had to wait till the system was functioning. Now the world has been turned upside down. Now it is the proponents of capitalism who have become the ideologues of today, and when we criticized their doings after privatizing water and the health systems and with the disastrous effects, they tell us, as we did before, wait, we are changing the world. We must see the free market system functioning again. So that is one question I would like to hear from you on about, is the importance of ideology. And that is number one. And then secondly, I would like to ask you what we can do to further our work in building bridges on the one hand between individuals and groups, and then putting our ideals into action. I think it is important to do this by encouraging states to look at their own legal frameworks and be more active in the international arena to encourage a change in international law for the benefit of human rights. So the question is, how do we change the world? How do we bring into effect? How do we bring into action, into practice our ideals? I think we should have a very open discussion. I am not necessarily directing it into these channels, but want to hear your views and your ideas. Who would like to start? You don't have to say anything very profound or very, I'm not for the we are developing our ideas, so you can just experiment. Yes, good.
Okay, and if you could introduce yourself also before.
I study event management, so for me events would be the big one. I think if you create a lot of events that can change you can spread the word around, and you can make some campaigns, you can make conferences here, different type of event, maybe something creative. So I would go for events.
I might not have the answer to your question, but a question that came up when you were speaking of cultural diplomacy and ideology is how do we could consider the risk of a state to maybe abuse cultural diplomacy, especially because it becomes more important now, and states are focusing on this area of academia also, that a state abuses cultural diplomacy just to push the old frame of its ideology to the world.
That's actually a good point too. I just want to underline it and maybe inspire a few other thoughts too. When or can cultural diplomacy be bad? And if so, under what circumstances? And also soft power. Can soft power be used for bad purposes? So does anyone have any response? Because there's sort of the expectation, cultural diplomacy, that's always good, but you raise a very good point. Can it be bad? And maybe perhaps, which agents of cultural diplomacy could use it for bad purposes or for which agendas? Anyone have any thoughts or any examples, maybe, of when cultural diplomacy could be used in a negative way, or has been used in a negative way? Or what are the risks? What are the limitations? That's a good point. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. I always say at ICD we pose questions, we don't have answers. So in that sense, really, hopefully we can get many answers.
With cultural diplomacy, you can obviously, as a country or as a group, you can promote cultural diplomacy of what your culture or what your country believes in, but whilst doing that you have to be able to listen to other cultures. So that's the whole point. If you're just out there to promote your own culture without ever understanding other cultures, then it's kind of counterproductive.
Good point in terms of different kinds of cultural diplomacy. Other thoughts, other comments?
I'd just like to say that I think you are quite right. The first point, that the first thing is to bring people together and create events, as you said. And that is one of the ideas behind the work, or the work the ICD is based on, bringing people together in a kind of melting pot, to voice their ideas and have an open discussion. And I think that is also the answer to your question, that discussion, openness, bringing people together with different views, that is our weapon in combating those who want to misuse cultural diplomacy. It's openness, it's democracy. There was somebody there?
Yeah, sorry, speaking in public kind of stresses me out. But it is what he said about like listening and not promoting your own culture only. Like communication is a process, and by organizing all these conferences, which I find very interesting, you bring lots of people together and you can exchange ideas and understanding, and that is what is really important. It's about communicating, and it's good that like there's internet and we can spread ideas around the world, but these conferences bring people together in person, and that is important, I think. That is interesting.
One example that Professor Joseph Nah from Harvard University that always gives in terms of where soft power can be used also in a negative way is bin Laden. And he said, look, bin Laden didn't pay anyone to fly into the World Trade Center. He didn't scare them into flying into the World Trade Center. He attracted them to his interpretation of quote-unquote religion, and that was bin Laden's soft power. And so that's one example where soft power could be used for destructive purposes. Another example, let's say it's been in the news recently, North Korea. The famous Dennis Rodman sports culture diplomacy, I think is a great example where actually North Korea in this case was being quite successful at, I don't know if you want to call it cultural diplomacy, I would call it propaganda. But as I heard Dennis Rodman singing happy birthday, to this dictator, wow, everybody wondered how much did this guy get paid for this? And apparently they didn't get paid this and that, who knows? But that, again, I think if for negative purposes was really a way that actually, I in my opinion, I'd love to hear your voices, Dennis Rodman was really used as part of a propaganda, in this case of North Korea, to sort of show this approval of these NBA stars. And so there again, I would argue that's a misuse maybe of culture or cultural diplomacy, if we want to call it that. And then just another example to respond to what you were saying, Mr. Jónasson, regarding democracy. A successful use of cultural diplomacy for the Americans was during the Cold War, where the Americans would send jazz ambassadors all over the world. But one of the reasons it was successful is, as you were saying, it was about freedom of choice. They sent very often jazz musicians who had actually problems and criticisms with the American situation. Very often African-American musicians who obviously had a lot of problems in the US at that time due to segregation and racism. And I think that's why it worked. The fact that the American government was willing to send individuals who also were critical of the government actually helped the image of the US abroad. Because in the Soviet Union, you don't disagree with the state. And the fact that in this case it was possible in the USA to have open debates, to have discussions, to criticize, actually had a positive effect and actually impressed many, hey, wait, maybe this democracy thing, there's something to that. So just to that point of openness, especially in today's age of WikiLeaks, etc., very, very important. That even to allow others to be critical can be very helpful in actually moving your own cause forward, as opposed to this idea, there's one voice, there's one way, everyone thinks the same. So in that case, another maybe successful use of cultural diplomacy, also allowing and actually supporting criticism of yourself in the sense, was I think a positive thing in that period of time during the Cold War. So it's something we'll come back to also throughout your internship, but what are the limitations? How can this be used in good or in bad ways? Let's get some other comments. Also in terms of human rights and culture diplomacy, which as you all know or you may not know, has really been absent from culture diplomacy. Up until now, culture diplomacy is just talking about the good things, the nice things, jazz, design, etc. Don't talk about human rights, don't talk about difficult things. Then we'll get into fights or arguments. But we really feel the opposite at ICD. It's very important to discuss these issues, even if they're divisive, even if they're difficult. Elvira can tell you stories about last week, some of the discussions we had, which were very controversial, where you have very different opinions on the African continent or in Europe on a variety of issues, especially when it comes to human rights. So, but there again, we thought it was important. We allowed those voices to be heard. We had a discussion on a lot of issues, which wasn't always comfortable, but we think is important. So I'd love to hear your opinions on that too. Are these two very different fields that should not be interconnected? Do you also see a benefit of including human rights in cultural diplomacy? So hopefully we've inspired some other comments or questions. Again, we're hoping to be quiet here, so we're already speaking too much.
I have a question with regards to human rights and cultural diplomacy, especially with regards to gender development, because there isn't much cultural diplomacy related to gender development and the enhancement of gender issues, especially in MENA countries. So what role do you think ICD can have and to develop this sector, to develop this this side of human rights?
Some of you may have heard of our initiative, Born Equal, on the website as one hint, or the event we're doing in Helsinki coming up as well. But those are just a few ideas. Can cultural diplomacy help with these issues? What are your thoughts? Is there a role for civil society? Here you can also give suggestions. We always talk about intern-led events or leadership initiatives. What ideas do you have? Okay.
For me, cultural diplomacy is really communicating with people who have different ideas or have different backgrounds than you have, and you can learn something from them, and maybe you can teach something to them as well. So I would say, in answer to your question, I think ICD can have an indirect way of helping this by organizing events and try to keep the conversation going and try to have people understand your point of view, but also try to understand their point of view.
Very important point. You are kind of quoting me from something I always repeat about really cultural diplomacy of the future, in our opinion, is much more about listening than speaking. I always say this expression I learned from the foreign minister of Mozambique: God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. That's the proportion of listening and speaking that we should have. And he was basically saying diplomats, that's their most important role. Go and listen. Don't say anything. Listen, for twice as long, and then maybe say something. And I think if that's the approach for cultural diplomacy, whether it's done by men or leading countries, etc., then it's actually very positive in terms of gender equality, etc., because what it means is you actually give voices to those who usually don't have voices, or maybe smaller voices, or less heard voices. So I think that's one way how cultural diplomacy done by anyone can actually help with lots of inequalities, whether you're dealing with majority, minority rights, ethnic issues, religious issues, gender issues. And then a few examples of what ICD is doing. If you haven't seen this, definitely check out our initiative called Born Equal, where we are trying directly to tackle that, in particular by responding to CEDAW, the initiative of the United Nations dealing with women. We actually had some interesting partners at the last conference from UN Women, where we're also trying to develop work directly with the UN in New York. And then the next event that we have in Helsinki is dealing more specifically with this issue, and that'll be led, it looks like, by Dr. Aratu Markoulis, who's the former foreign minister of Cyprus, also a woman, and the foreign minister of Finland, who's a man, but he's on our advisory board, Erkki Tamoja, but very much also involved in actually the promotion of women's rights. So that's, again, as you were saying, a way we can at least raise awareness of these issues, and then hopefully inspire others through our methodology of leadership initiatives after the conference to actually go and have their own projects using partners they met at the conference or also the ICD. And so that is something that is important for ICD. Those are a few ideas of things that we're doing in the coming weeks. But I really would welcome your initiatives also while you're here for the internship to maybe even do events while we're here or discussions focusing on these issues. And that would be a chance where you can actually come with a proposal. You can actually be the chairperson for the discussion. We can also invite external guests. So just keep that in mind as well. ideally the internship really should be a two-way street. Come with ideas, come with energy, bring people. We had one intern once who brought her mother as a speaker. She was actually in Sweden in charge of the year of multiculturalism, and it was great. And she was here visiting her daughter for the internship. We invited a few people from the embassies also to join in the discussion. It was great. So whether it's your mother or whether it's people that you know, definitely come. Bring people here, bring ideas, and I think that the ICD will really benefit. We don't just want one generation to decide what's happening, but really all generations. So that's kind of my plea to you now for ideas, and also throughout your internship to come with ideas for events that we're already doing, or for new events. Or it can be doing film screenings, it can be discussions, it can be just cultural evenings. The ICD house is yours. So keep this in mind. If you do want to do events here, we really welcome that for the ICD and also for the public. So,
but I think you are right that cultural diplomacy is about communication, as you were indeed saying as well, and it's a two-way process. It's communicating your own ideas and listening to other people's ideas. And when it comes to gender equality, we have a conference in Finland next month on the issue of gender equality. Now, the discussion can take different forms depending on who is taking part in it. Is it people from very different cultures where the cultures are communicating about these differences, or is it a conference or a gathering of like-minded people or people from similar backgrounds where we can compare laws that have been acted in one place and discuss the experience of those laws? For instance, in Iceland, where you have introduced by law a quota system, whereby there should be a certain quota of the genders in the governing bodies of not only institutions of the state and municipalities, but also in businesses. Is this good or is this bad? Different opinions, but all stimulating a debate on the issues, because one method of dealing with gender equality is discussing it all the time and discussing the experience we have in our lawmaking processes.
Another great example is Rwanda, where you have the highest number of female members of parliaments for any parliament, I think, in the world. So the Nordic countries are very good examples, but also from Africa, Rwanda is a very strong example.
But if we start discussing the feasibility of quotas, gender quotas, we don't discuss anything else here today, I'm sure. And so it is with other issues, if we deal with them, we can talk a long time. So it's probably best to have the debate rather general, but I think it's a good point you raised with that, the issue of gender equality, which is a question of human rights.
ICD, it's a platform of conversation, right? We talk and we have discussions. Well, you talk, hopefully I'll do it in the future as well. But how does ICD try and get to the lower levels to improve diplomacy at a human being level, like people, because it's not going to change, not just until politicians change ideas and start having real conversations, but unless the people start changing their way of thinking. So how does ICD actually try and reach everyone, not just at high levels? Thank you very much.
Well, I think you are touching a fundamental issue here, and something I was referring to in my lecture, that politics is not about power, as I see it. It's about the way society thinks. When I was younger, the right-wingers in Iceland would never have dreamt of doing what right-wingers in politics are doing now. I'm referring to privatization and all kinds of fundamental change in society. they would not have imagined doing it themselves, and society would never have allowed them to do what they've been doing today. Why? Because society has changed. The way people think has changed. And this has partly to do with changes internationally, that, capitalist ideas have been sort of more on the offensive than socialist ideas, and the proponents of capitalist ideology have been more active in cultivating the ground and preparing the dishes we now see on the table. And they're able to do this because society has changed. And as I see it, the task of politicians is to try to influence the way society reacts and thinks. That is the core of politics, as I see it. And it's in this respect that we come into the arena, the ICD, with a concentration on human rights. And we want to change attitudes in the world. We want to activate the world in the cause of human rights. And this we want to do by discussion, by building bridges between individuals and groups. And then we want to also concentrate on actual concrete changes in laws in individual states and internationally as well.
Maybe I'll offer a brief response as well. So essentially, the ICD strategy is to try to do what you're talking about there 3 ways. And to quote something from our conversation over lunch, much more important to ICD than the people inside the US Embassy are the people outside the US Embassy protesting for this and this reason or whatever it is. Or as I always say, the firefighters, the nurses, the high school teachers. Ultimately, that's the end goal. For me, everyone else is some sort of an intermediary, whether it's a head of state or a minister or a young leader. So the main way we try to do it is threefold. First of all, to do it directly. One example, we did an event funded by the US State Department about 2 years ago, commemorating the victims of Hurricane Katrina, where we brought actually 3 artists from New Orleans to Berlin. We did an exhibition on a freight ship where they actually brought 360 dresser drawers from New Orleans here, and that was the exhibition. The idea of the artists is that usually in the USA you hide your most valuable goods in the back of the dresser drawer. And the idea is these dresser drawers should be telling the story of actually the victims of Hurricane Katrina. So part of this initiative was this exhibition where we actually went to the east, to the west, all over the city with this booth. The second part was a community outreach where we actually took the artists while they were here in Berlin for about 2 months, and we actually went to high schools all over Berlin, and they worked with school kids where they actually made with cardboard boxes their own dresser drawers, and actually were telling their own stories through these dresser drawers that were later on actually then exhibited on the freighter as well. So that was one way where we really tried to go to the community, and that's always the biggest advice I give people, especially embassies, when it comes to cultural diplomacy. Don't worry so much about getting them in your embassy. Go to them. Go to the schools. Go to the community centers. Go to the library. It's much more important, whether it's an ambassador or a diplomat, etc. So that's one way. Do it directly. Another interesting thing we did was Black History Month. Now, this is also about 2 years ago in the America House, Berlin. Black History Month is a very famous American tradition every February, where they actually celebrate African-American history as well as African diaspora as a whole. It doesn't happen so much abroad. In the UK, it's usually in October they celebrate it. Beyond that, it's not so present. So anyway, so it's important that we do that here in Berlin. And what we did there also were the Black History Month Awards, where we tried to give awards, we did give awards to people in the community who had actually made a difference in terms of helping, whether it was children or others, etc., really having an impact on society and community. They were for us the VIPs, not the ambassadors who came or the others. So that would be one way, directly. Second way we try to do it is indirectly. You may have seen we do a lot of work with what we call young leaders. For us, a young leader is someone, I always say, who's a driver, not a passenger. People who want to give to society, not take from society. And that hunger, that motivation to give is much more important to us than what kind of grades they got in college or this and that. So those are the kinds of individuals we tried to bring for the bilateral programs like Germany meets Turkey, a forum for young leaders, or multilateral programs like cultural diplomacy in Africa. So that would be a second way, indirectly. One example of that I always refer to, we spoke about this also today over lunch, is a German young leader from our Germany meets Turkey program who started the first high school exchange program between the city of Köln, Germany and Turkey. Despite the fact that there's a huge Turkish diaspora in the area around Köln, at that time there were no high school exchange programs with Turkey, even though they had it with the USA, with France, with the UK, etc. And that was also really important, where he was really able to touch society. Not only the kids who were involved, but their parents, that were sometimes more difficult to convince them of this project than the kids, or their brothers, their sisters, etc. So that's another way where the elites, the young leaders, etc., can really also have an impact on society. Important was that it comes from within. It's not somebody from the outside necessarily doing this project, but it's somebody from within the certain group or the community that can help to make it successful. And then the third way is obviously by trying to have an impact on leaders. We bring not only former people here, former heads of state, former ministers, but also some current. Very often former later on also become current, in the case of the current foreign minister of Finland. And by having an impact on them, we can also hopefully have an impact when they then go and make policies. And there, from the American context, the Republicans are just as important as the Democrats. And those who are maybe traditionally not as sensitive to these issues actually matter more. So in the USA, we actually do a lot of work with the Republicans, with actually hard power sort of proponents, whether it's generals or former generals, for exactly that reason, that I think there's more work to be done sometimes amongst those groups. So that's a third way where we really try to have an impact on actually leaders by working with them and bringing them. And very important is both sides. You may notice this while you're here. You say, why is ICD bringing somebody from this party or from this, and etc. And very often they're the ones who actually need this more. So be aware in case you see sometimes speakers and you say, why is this speaker coming? And very often it's those, or I always say we don't want to preach to the choir in that sense. We try to really bring individuals from all walks, from all fields, even those less likely traditionally to be responsive to these kinds of things. And keep that in mind as well, because you're going to help us inviting speakers, etc. As you're searching for speakers. We really do want to do as much as we can to bring those who really need culture diplomacy and can benefit, as opposed to just those who are naturally already interested in these things.
But I think it's a very valid question somebody raised. How do we get the message or the method of cultural diplomacy from the conference room and into society? And I think this is a valid question, something one should be thinking about all the time. But just think about it, that we are here sitting together, 40, 50 people. And we are having a discussion. And we are all going to think about what the others have been saying, and not only here, but in the coffee room. And I always say that the most important part of a conference is the coffee room, when people actually start talking together. But we all of us become the message, to use the phrase from my lecture. We all become the message. And when each of you, 40, 50 people, communicate with another 40, 50 people, it starts to have an effect. And the way, I don't want to become very political, I'm a very political man, but you see, when Reagan and Thatcher came to power in the late 70s and early 80s, they constituted think tanks in America and in Britain. Very few people. And then they set them on missions. I knew all about it. I was a television reporter in Iceland, and I interviewed the whole lot of them. Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, Buchanan, they all came there, and we all made programs about them. There was nobody from the left. They were all dead or quiet. And then you see, this gradually started to have an effect. They were there everywhere. They had lectures in universities, in small groups and large groups. They were on radio, they wrote articles. And they prepared the soil. They prepared the soil for the capitalist garden. And now we have we are suffering the cultivation. But it had an effect. Few people, but proportionally having an effect throughout society. So ideas do make a change if you work for it. And they had the fervor to work for it. And now we are going to work for cultural diplomacy, which is not an aggressive idea. It's about building bridges. And even if I am talking with this emphasis on my political views, we of course have different opinions, all of us, but we are simply discussing them, communicating, and it's a two-way process.
Speaking of the two-way process, other contributions, questions, comments? Both sides? Okay, ladies first.
Okay. So connecting the issue of how do we touch the people, and then going back to your question about how do we change the world, I think that one possible answer would be through education, and maybe by investing in educating young people, the issues that we talk about today will no longer be issues in the future, because they only become so because we are taught since we are young that the gender issue is an issue, or the multicultural issue is an issue. So I think that's the way to do it. And coming from a country that has Romania that has been hoping for a change and has been talking about how the young people are going to be the change of the future, that change will never come if we don't invest in those young people that we expect to be our future. And I remember this quote, I can't remember the person who said it, that when we should never say to a young girl, for example, if we go back to the gender issue, you can do everything that you want when you grow up, because she would never think otherwise. So it's by by changing the way that young people see history, geography, relations with other different people. I think that's the way how we can bring a big change that does not necessarily come from just one person, like you were talking about Mandela or Gandhi. That's one way that the world has changed, but also the more responsible and sure way to change the world is to educate the young people, the future leaders and just the future population of the world. Thank you.
I think you are so right that the emphasis on education is all important. Now, if the educational systems were only concerned with making or producing doctors or engineers, experts in building bridges and roads and constructions, and there was never any thought about other dimensions in life. This is, of course, the idea behind the educational projects of ICD, to divert our attention on these issues, educating or having education in these fields. And I'm absolutely in agreement with you there.
I completely agree on what you have said, and actually I wanted to share some thoughts related to this education, but focus on young people, children, teenagers maybe, because I think that I have always thought that they are like a kind of pillar for any society. So for example, I mean that the values, interests, and respect, and also the way to learn how to communicate could be taught when children are, when people are young. So I think it could be interesting to use young generations, in order to grow them in with more respectful way and with good behavior. But I have always thought that, for example, we usually think on human rights not when we are young, but we start to get some knowledge about them when after that. Sorry, public speaking is not I'm not very good at it either. I wanted to say that, for example, what would happen if we teach what is happening in the world, for example, the violations of human rights that are currently happening nowadays to young children. Maybe these children could grow up with different interests and with some kind of very positive values, and it could be like a start of a change. And I know it's pretty difficult as well, because it's not always possible to have a general or a global education system, and because there are a lot of political interests and other interests inside, but try to focus on maybe this generation, and to grow up such values could be an option. Thank you.
I would like to ask a question to Mr. Jonasson, if I can. You talked in your lecture about the ideals that drive people to change the world and to build their careers on. And I want to ask, what was your ideal and the main thing you wanted to change, and what was your reason for going into politics?
I've always been very, very political. I come from a family of mixed politics. My father was a conservative. He was a right-winger. My parents, my mother's family was red. You know, they were all socialists or communists. But I discovered that my father, the right-winger, he was often more radical than the left-wingers of my mother's side. So I was always free of thinking in narrow political boxes, because in my house, you know, there were all these views. Now, I became a trade unionist at an early age, and then I was the leader of the labor union of Icelandic radio and television, and then of the Federation of State and Municipal Employees for over 20 years. Now, we were fighting for better pays and better rights, but above all for equality. And when I looked at such issues, I always looked towards the welfare system, equal access to the welfare system, to the hospital, to the schools, etc. So I put more emphasis on that than I did on the fight for pay, more on the welfare system and an equal and just society. That has always been an inspiration in my life. And I became Minister of Health and then Minister of the Interior in Iceland after the economic crash. There was a collapse in our economy in the autumn of 2008. And we had been experiencing a development where inequality was on the rise. The difference between the haves and have-nots was becoming ever greater. And we have a saying in Iceland that when you are in rough seas on a boat, the way to get out of trouble through the waves is take to the oars together. You all take to the oars together. But a precondition for doing that is being on the same boat. You must be on the same boat. So when I became minister and we had a new government in the early weeks of 2009, our task was to put people on the same boat, try to make society more just, more equal. You know, this has always been the inspiration of my politics.
I have a question with regards to my country, where there have been so many different policies made by our government, by our politicians. So the society, they are closed now. You know, they've lost the trust they had for people in charge of the country. So, in your opinion, what is the best way for government, for politicians to bring that trust back? How to, what needs to be done to bring people back to believe in what the politicians say and promise nowadays?
I am engaged with now, I think about all the time, is the philosophy of Mandela and Gandhi, that you yourself becoming the message. I mean, you must show with your own deeds that you are practicing what you are preaching. You must do that yourself. So I can tell you a little secret, although I never told it in Iceland. And since this is not direct television, I decided when we were cutting down in the social services in Iceland, and the buying power of ordinary workers and employees were being diminished, I decided that I would never take money or payment for being a minister. I was cutting down for others, so I started by cutting down my own wages. And if you are wanting to get trust of the people, you must start with yourself. There must be, you must show by your own deeds that you mean what you are saying. And we went through very great difficulties. We had to cut down in expenditures of state and municipalities between 20 and 25% in real terms. It's a lot. A lot of people lost their jobs, and if you do not show in some way that you mean what you are saying, what you mean what you are saying, and that you do to yourself what you are doing to others, you will never have trust. But I never thought about this, although I'm telling you this little secret. But I knew inside. It was enough to know it myself. And it gave me moral strength. But I think the difficulty with trust is that people have the feeling that politicians are living in another world to the one they are preaching. And that will never give the political world the trust it so needs.
Not how to make people believe to politics, but how to empower people to participate in politics, because it's also linked to human rights, democracy. And if people don't participate, it's like others decide about the people. Politics should be for the people, not the people for the politics. And the other question is related to, well, it's about more to right and left, is that if we look about practices, today's issue, which are in Europe, immigration, social insecurity, financial insecurity, if you look at these things, left-wing parties don't actually have the possibility, or not the possibility, but they don't really have the answer for these questions, while right-wing people have. Because it's just like only one group of people give a solution, although left-wings also have answers, but these answers are maybe not long-term solutions.
I think you are right that the change that occurred is that the right-wingers have solutions, while left-wingers have become the pragmatists the right-wingers were yesterday, really. But then also there has been a tremendous confusion in politics, I think. For instance, in Great Britain, if I was a right-winger, I would have voted for Tony Blair, because he stood so far to the right. But so people are confused with that, and I think there is going to be a great change in political thinking in the coming years and decades, and I am sure that the call of the 21st century will be more democracy and direct democracy. People will want to decide directly in votes, in referendum, on big issues. And this will be a challenge to the institutional world of politics, where political parties will lose powers. And there have been a lot of discussion about this recently. I took part in a conference on democracy in Strasbourg last November, I think it was. I gave a talk there. There was a lot of talk in the parliamentary session of the Council of Europe last week on the question of direct democracy, and everybody was against. The institutional world of politics reacted very violently against this idea, but I think this is going to be the means of empowering people, which you refer to, direct democracy, more democracy. I'm sure that will be the call of the 21st century.
Then I actually have to disagree with you, sorry. But if we look
now we are starting, okay.
Because if you look at the UK, for example, the UK is now the example, UKIP, BNP, these parties actually gaining more and more popularity, these extreme right-wing parties. And then if you, for example, look at Labour and Conservative, historically Labour should be a left-wing party, but their policy is, I mean, it's like the Conservatives is the same. And about participation, if you talk about it will be more direct, that people will be more involved in politics. If you look at statistics about European Union elections, national elections, more and more people just abstain. They just don't go voting. So these people are they need to be empowered. And at some point, I think for the majority of the political parties, it's good because they have a smaller community who they can mobilize, and it's good to make the majority, well, lose their faith in politics.
Yes, but I ask you another question there. How do you want to empower people?
I mean, empowering people could go in many ways. For example, politicians don't sit in parliament all the time taking 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 euros per month. Instead of it, they go out to talk with the people. They ask for the opinion of the people, not just create some platform online and send your message. It should be more direct. Politics should be bring closer to the people. For example, in the UK, where I come from in Hungary, there are politicians basically, well, the only duty for people is to elect them, nothing else. But in the UK, at least there's a little hint that they go to the houses, they knock on the doors, they try to talk with people, to promote discussions. Because if every 4 years or 5 years they promote discussions, it won't bring it won't bring empowerment to the people. It's just their duties to vote.
Yeah, but then I ask, and I ask all of you now to think about it. I, as a politician, have certain views, have certain standpoints. Should I change my views, my standpoints, if you, my voters, tell me in a discussion that I should change my views? I say no. We will have a discussion. We will argue about it. But if I have a belief in what I stand for, I don't change it. But you can throw me out. And that is what you should do. You should throw me out. So democracy is not a question of taking direction necessarily for others if that is against your conviction, but creating a system whereby you can elect or throw out people you are happy with. But at the same time, I think we should develop democracy in a sense where you can, in a direct way, bypass me, people like me, bypass the institutional world of politics and decide directly in a vote on certain issues. And then you say, well, this could open the doors for extreme views, possibly. Then I say, so be it. And this will mean that society at large must mobilize itself in a democratic way. And I think that is a very serious thing, what you are referring to, what is happening with regard to belief in politics and others, and the low participation in parliamentary elections, in elections to the European Parliament, etc. So something must be done. And I think the idea here is direct democracy. But I'm willing to go to meetings, I'm willing to knock on doors, but if you can't convince me to change my opinions, I won't. But you please throw me out at the next election and demand more direct democracy for you yourself.
But I actually didn't mean this. Politicians or parliament, they should create a platform. For example, in the Nordic countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, or I take another example, Switzerland. In Switzerland, when there is a big issue which concerns the people, there is a referendum. So they make a referendum which concerns the people. While in many countries, they just, politicians in parliament, they decide about the fate above the people, above the people's head. So I don't mean that you should change. It's very good that you represent people, and there is lots of people from right to left, and it should be represented. I just mean these people should get the average citizens closer to politics, and it would be referendums, discussions, dialogues, which could promote it.
Somebody else? Yeah.
Hi. I think what is important to remember is also that politics is not just in the parliament and party politics, but it happens on every levels of society. And I think when it comes to empowerment, you empower people by giving them a feeling of ownership. You have to be a part of something, and you can be that on a grassroots level, civil society movement level, and through that maybe shake the politicians up here a little bit. So I think, yeah, that's an important aspect to remember, and I think this level is important to always include, also here at ICD, for instance, to work with all kinds of different levels in society, all kinds of different movements, and not only diplomats. So yeah, so we get like a more holistic perspective on different issues and can really learn from each other.
I agree that empowerment and politics exist at many levels, and what we are experiencing here now, these minutes, is the empowerment of you. The meeting started today with me speaking alone in a rostrum, and now we sit down here, and then gradually you are taking the power. You know, this is empowerment as well. So as many people speaking as possible. My experience from my university days in Edinburgh, where we had seminars, tutorials, as they were called like that, was encouraging people to speak. And even if, and nobody should wait to say the Nobel Prize winning sentence, you know, because we should just experiment with ourselves. When I speak, I often say things that I regret a few minutes later, and it was probably not very wise. But it's taking part in a discussion, and everybody should be free and open to express himself or herself.
I wouldn't need to go to referendums like every time it's an important decision. It would be enough if every time there's elections, for example, like my politicians would tell me what they are up for, and like their morality, they would go for that. So then I choose, and I would be like, feel really like comfortable when they take my decisions for me, because I knew from before the ideals. The problem now is that there's no morality, so for getting the vote, they just promise things, tell they are in a way, and then they do the other way. So that's why I'm not, I don't feel like, I don't feel like comfortable like with my politicians, because it would be really nice if what they had promised or the way they want to work was the way they've told us they were going to work. And I wouldn't have to go to referendums for important decisions. They would be in the hands of my politicians.
You like it to be in the hands of the politicians? No.
If they do what they say.
Yes.
If they do it the way they've told me they were going to do it, and I've voted for them because I like the way they are going to do it. But if they tell me a way, and then I vote them, and the day after I vote them, they just turn the thing around. That's what's the problem and why I'm so unconfident now.
Well, I would like to introduce a bit in the discussion like the role of private companies in promoting cultural diplomacy and I think human rights, because I think one topic which is very like trendy in the last 10 years is corporate social responsibility, and I think private companies since the outburst of the crisis, the economic crisis, have been suffering like a decline or a bit in reputation. So I think they have a big role as globalization and in relation with the internationalization of the economies in promoting cultural diplomacy, human rights. So I would like to ask you, what do you think about these initiatives? Like, for example, in the ICD we are promoting an initiative called Corporate Cultural Diplomacy, which is in relation with CSR, corporate social responsibility. So I think I would like to ask you, what is your opinion about the role that private companies, multinational companies, have in promoting human rights, and how they can enforce like principles that are adopted in international organizations like the United Nations or the International Labour Organization?
Yes, I think you have touched on something which is absolutely crucial.